Alright, welcome everyone. I'm just going to do a quick 10 to 12 minute download on some of the research that I've done regarding leadership. And this comes from a paper called Deconstructing the Shared Leadership Emergence Process in Entrepreneurial Teams. This paper was written in the Journal of Small Business and Enterprise Development by Linden and Pendy. So you can take a look at this in your various research facilities if you have any. So the leadership emergence process is covered in these particular flows, and what you'll notice is that there are some correlations and there's some interesting insights beyond this, and I'll share with you what my thoughts are. They claim that there is shared interpersonal cognition leading to two types of ways of establishing shared leadership, which is claiming of leadership versus granting of leadership. And this seems to be a really big thing in terms of what kind of permissions you give others to lead you versus how you take on that leadership and you acquire control, so to speak. There's another aspect of trust, which I think goes down a really big rabbit hole because almost everything is about trust and respect over here. So we're going to take a look at how they're related. In my opinion, although the authors indicate that there's a positive relationship between shared cognitions and claiming and granting of leadership, whereas trust is only about granting of leadership, sometimes I feel that trust also has an implication for claiming of leadership, because you can claim that the other person is doing it for selfish reasons, for example. But if you don't have that, then you have a probable chance of enabling other people to claim leadership more effectively. So I believe that the process of claiming and granting leadership is the reason why teams are slow at norming. Whereas if you have got mature founders, you're probably likely to have a give and take approach in a much faster fashion. So if you've known each other for maybe 10 years, 12 years, or you've also run a business for that amount of time, chances are you kind of know the dynamics between these two. And if you have matured, it's more likely that you can do the various things that are indicated here. So firstly, if claiming and granting is reinforced, they get something called a positive spiral, which leads to the emergence of leader and follower. If not, there's ambiguity over here where no one claims, or if two people claim, or in my opinion, it's not just about two people claiming, but a lack of parity in terms of the claim. Then that becomes negative spiraling, leading to the need for rational persuasion, emotional appeal, and coalition that then leads to emergence of leader and follower. I have some problem with this. I think coalition is probably a tactic that goes beyond. It may create more trust issues, and we don't know the relationship between trust and coalition, especially with regard to the person acting against the coalition. And shared and interpersonal cognition may actually suffer as a result of coalition. So in my opinion, I think what these two do, rational persuasion and emotional appeal, is that they increase shared interpersonal cognition, and chances are they also share trust. In other words, if I'm divulging something that is vulnerable about myself, it's likely to engender more trust, and I don't think the authors have actually captured that. However, it does look like a really logical model, and I'm going to switch over to share with you what I saw and what I thought about this model in terms of entrepreneurial teams being flatter and having to have the agility and nimbleness to have this open space. So let's take a look at Linden and Pendy's approach, right? So in terms of creating shared interpersonal cognition, they claim that there's a dimension of self versus other, weakness versus strength. So if I'm aware of my own strength and I'm aware of support in areas that people cannot handle, I am more likely to claim. Whereas if I'm aware of what I'm weak at and I have an appreciation of strength in what others are best in, I'm more likely to grant. And this makes a perfect model to have conversations about within a team structure, especially with co-founders. And I think it goes beyond just strengths. I think it's a question of knowing the foundation. In other words, I believe there is a relationship between sharing of interpersonal cognition and trust based on the nature of the Johari window. So if you are vulnerable enough to share something, you have got to trust that the other person is going to listen to you. If that person isn't going to listen to you, there's likely less trust, and therefore there is a negative relationship here. So in that case, we'll want to explore what it means to build trust. I think the authors indicate trust in competence and trust as in intent as very broad strokes. I believe that there must be also trust in process. For example, I might just simply say, okay, you share one thing and I share one thing that we know of each other, and then you tell me whether that's correct or that's wrong. And you start off that way. There's a process that enables a conversation to actually take place. And I think that's an interesting missing piece that should be included: trust in process, right? So yes, I can trust in competence, I can trust in intent, but competence also means, do I have that longitudinal dimension to be able to understand the person, to see the person in action, and so on? And then to trust in intent, I think it's important to recognize that a person's intention is also demonstrated in their behaviors, right? So if you observe what their behaviors are, whether they are having faith in team members, or whether they allow others to take charge of a situation because there is a positive intent. Actually, positive intent can actually be supported if it is a value set that is granted within the organization. Most of the time it is implicit, and I think this has got to change and be made explicit within the organization. So likewise, even in sharing of interpersonal cognitions, whether you want to claim leadership but you don't talk about it, that can create a lot of negativity as well. So while claiming leadership typically leads to either a positive or negative spiral, positive or negative spiral, in my opinion, I think it's also about the ability to share what it is that you actually want, and therefore be able to say, okay, you know what, why didn't you take it? And I think in terms of granting the leadership, sometimes it's just out of convenience. And I think there's no collective conversation in order to claim and grant. Whereas if it is positively reinforced, as what the authors are suggesting, the more you positively reinforce by saying, hey, you know what, Jane, your ability to sell is fantastic, and I don't think I can measure up to that. So is it okay if you take over while I learn from you? That turns into a positive spiral because the other person is reinforced. And yet, this is insufficient because there are stages in the cycle, right? In terms of team development, there may be some people who start off well, but then as an emergent trend of changes that happen within business, other people become more competent in a different style of selling, which may emerge through the months or years. So it's important to trace the longitudinal capabilities of an individual so that claiming and granting is reflected upon, and to be able to put the best person in charge of these things on a regular basis. So that the positive spiral will continue to cause the right kind of leader and follower to emerge. So when we look at things like both claiming, there is what the authors suggest, that the decisions of one member being challenged by others, non-verbal cues of non-acceptance, and express displeasure. What this reminds me of is the Phiro B, where it suggests that the expressed level of control versus the wanted level of control is in a form of disparity. And because of that, it can lead to a negative spiral. And I agree to a certain extent. I think it's a question of compatibility here. And if it's compatible, chances are you will end up reinforcing and claiming if you express it. Unfortunately, you can lead to a negative spiral even if a person wants to claim leadership and attempts to claim leadership, but the other person doesn't read it as an attempt to claim leadership. So in other words, I want to claim leadership, but you are unwilling to relinquish control, not because you didn't hear from me, but because you didn't even communicate it in the first place. So other possibilities are like unilateral claiming and granting. So for example, somebody just wants freedom, right? And someone else ends up having to pick up the slack because the other person is wanting freedom and simply claims freedom for himself or herself. So the other partner has to take on that role of picking up the leadership that he or she does not want. And as a result of that, that becomes a bit of a challenge, isn't it? So it can lead to a negative spiral also. The reason why I underlined and italicized this is because this is not in the research paper, but I think it actually gives us a little bit of a frame in terms of what leadership really entails. Next one is both unwilling to claim. All right, so as I mentioned before, when both claim, it's a little bit easier to see that there is tension, but there's also motivation. But if one wants someone else to claim it, which is kind of like the opposite of this one, right? So unilaterally means I don't want it, you don't want it, but I have to do it because you claim something else that takes up your time. This is where you want someone to claim it, but the other person doesn't want control. You may suggest to somebody, hey, why don't you do the sales side of the equation? I'll do the development side of the equation, but the other person doesn't want it. So once this is done, you'll come to realize that the negative spiral approach has got three conclusions. One is coalition. As I mentioned, I have doubts about whether coalition really helps in the long run, but it may be necessary in order to create a tipping point in terms of points of view. And if everything comes to a head, sometimes it's necessary to take a vote and say, let's, the highest vote in whichever direction wins. The rational persuasion versus emotional appeal kind of reminds me of the MBTI decision dichotomy, which is thinking versus feeling, or rather logic versus values. And I think it's valuable for leaders in the entrepreneurial sense to get a sense of what the other co-founders have in terms of their decision-making styles. Once you're able to do that, you realize that the rationality and the emotional appeal can have a broad spectrum as long as you're open to have that conversation. In other words, it's the trust element. And secondly, it also entails that we have to have a better way of uncovering blind spots, because I can have a rational appeal and motivate you down the wrong direction. I can also have an emotional appeal that brings you down the wrong direction, but we need to be able to merge it effectively and say what are the risks, and as a result of that, there needs to be the emergence of what we call a devil's advocate, which is great for team discussions and stuff like that. All right. So as you take a look at some of these, things like ambiguity, they happen quite a lot. And sometimes a lot of these unclaimed are not because of what the author suggests, that nobody's willing to take charge, people express their inabilities, or nobody knows how to handle a situation. It also may be unknown or undiscovered. So because of this possibility, like for example, when the pandemic takes place or you start expanding and you didn't really know what's going to happen, and this is probably the bulk of things, not as if people just have lots of free time to say, you know what, let's not take charge of this. I think everybody wants to take charge in some sense or other, and as a result, you're going to go into third-party consulting, right? So you either find mentors, which is the bulk of it, and hey, you're in super scaling, so the inner circle is where you can find mentors and you can find friends. What the authors found, is that when people look for friends, they claim that it manages their stress and helps them to look at problems from different perspectives. And I think that this means that there must be diversity of view from both mentors as well as friends. And we don't know the relationship between managing stress and looking at problems from a different perspective. Because I can anticipate if you're more relaxed, right, you'll be able to see things from different perspectives anyhow. So maybe your friends just provide stress management, and then after that you go like, aha, right? Or it functions like they give you a different perspective, and therefore your stress is actually managed. You realize, oh, there's a way forward to this. So I believe that these two things also happen with mentors anyway. Okay, so I don't think it's just a function of friendship alone. And what's telling is that investors are the last people that they go to, probably because it's more like a punitive thing. If you don't know what you're doing in your approach of an investor, it feels like you've just taken away some points in the eyes of the investors in the first place. So in any case, I hope this has been useful, and take a look at how you can implement this from the standpoint of becoming more effective in your development of leadership, especially in shared cognition and establishment of trust.